Okay, wonderful. I'm also just going to drop the link to the magazine in the chat, just in case any of you haven't received it. So, hello, everyone, and welcome to Citizens for Global Solutions World Citizen Book Club. Today is Saturday, the 1st of March. My name is James May. I'm a Senior Program Officer at CGS, and I'm your moderator for today's book club. I'm pleased to see all of you here. Welcome. As we have just set off, we are recording today's session. This video will be available on CGS's YouTube channel by mid next week. If this is your first time at book club and you would like to be kept informed about upcoming book club sessions, please drop a message in the chat and we will add you to our group mailing list. Also, please feel free to introduce yourself to everyone. Before we get into today's sessions, I would like to welcome Keshet Benchikovsky, who has joined the CGS Secretariat as a Program Associate. Welcome to Book Club, Keshet. Today is a special session on the winter 2025 issue of Mondial, CGS's flagship publication. In case you haven't yet received the digital copy, I've just dropped it in the chat, as I mentioned, so you can check that out on our website. We're honored today to be joined by 5 contributors to the latest issue of Mondial. David Gallup is the Executive Director of our partner organization, the World Service Authority. He will kick us off with a discussion of an article he co-authored with Alex McIsaac on world citizenship, a recent phenomenon with ancient roots. And then Dr. Emlyn Koster will discuss his article Towards an Earth-Human Ecosystem. That will be followed by David Wolcombe, who will present an update on his article Solving the UN's Liquidity Crisis, Radical Thinking, covering some of the developments since he penned the article. We will then break for questions before continuing with presentations from our very own Hannah Fields, who will discuss her article, A Tale of Two Summits, Civil Society's Role in the UN Summit of the Future. Finally, we will come to Rebecca Shute, who you all know well, who will speak to us about her article, The Sword of Damocles Falls, the impact of US sanctions on the ICC, which will be followed by a second round of questions. Now, before I introduce each of the speakers more thoroughly, before they speak, as usual, I'll take us through housekeeping. As usual, we will ask everyone to keep their questions and comments when we come to those to just 2 minutes in each round. If you exceed that time, I will interject and ask you to wrap up so that everybody has an opportunity to speak. Today, that will be particularly pertinent given how many speakers we have. As I indicated, there will be 2 rounds of questions today, the first following the first 3 speakers and the second following the final 2. Does anybody object to those house rules? I don't see any hands. I will continue. Thank you. You can raise your virtual or physical hands or put your questions in the chat. I'll come to you on a first come, first served basis. I would ask you to help me with that because there are a lot of people today, so if I miss somebody, please highlight them. As we have so many fascinating speakers today, we will close with a very brief update rather than the usual 10 minutes, so that you can make any announcement that you'd like to our other book club members. With housekeeping out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce a book club regular and our first author, David Gallup. David specializes in human rights, world citizenship, and world law education. He is president and general counsel of the World Service Authority, a global public service human rights organization founded in 1954. He is also a board member of Citizens for Global Solutions, creator of the World Citizens Club Initiative, and convener of the World Court of Human Rights Coalition. David, it is my pleasure to hand over to you. Please take us away.
Thank you so much, James. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to speak with you today about world citizenship. So I'd like to start giving you the reason why Alex McIsaac and I wanted to write about world citizenship for Mondial, and that's because Mondial is the premier World Federalist journal. As world citizens and world federalists, we want to share in this forum the importance of our identity as world citizens in the development of structures and systems for governing our world. For humanity to achieve a peaceful, just, and sustainable world, we must create a holistic and ethical system of law and institutions at the global level. We must also recognize our role in creating that system by affirming a holistic and ethical identity, that of world citizenship. If we want a government of, by, and for the people of the world, if we want humanity to be the compassionate brain to help us govern our human lives in harmony with the earth, then we need to begin to see ourselves as world citizens first and foremost. Like Albert Einstein said, remember your humanity and forget the rest. World citizenship provides us with an awareness that the world already unites us, that we are one humanity, that we have universal rights and duties to each other and the planet, and that we should be loving and caring for each other and not killing one another. So now I'd like to guide you through a few slides to highlight the concept of citizenship as explained in Alex and my article through the lens of inclusion and unity. So I'll share my screen. So I'd like to start off by providing a definition of citizenship. So citizenship is how we engage with our rights and our duties in a particular community or social framework. So rights and duties are the first two elements. Another important element is membership, which is a sense of belonging to a community. It may be even a pride in being part of a community. Citizenship also implies participation, which would be active engagement in affirming our rights and duties in the community. So I've given you a definition of citizenship, but how is citizenship typically explained? So I like to show this picture of a still pond and ask the question, what happens when you throw a pebble into a still pond? Well, you get ripples or concentric circles, and that center drop of water could represent you and your family. That might be your first citizenship. You have rights and duties within that family structure. And then the next circle out would be city, and the next circle out would be region, then hemisphere, then Earth, Milky Way galaxy, the universe, and if there is such a thing, the multiverse. We are citizens within each of those circles simultaneously. But I would like to posit that actually citizenship is more like raindrops falling on that still pond and making multiple concentric circles that overlap. Because not only are you a citizen of your family, of your region, of the earth, but you are also a citizen of your friends group, of your work colleagues, of your Instagram followers. You have multiple communities in which you participate. So it's kind of like a Venn diagram of overlapping circles. You exist in multiple communities in which you have rights and duties or expectations of behavior. Wait, let me admit somebody. Okay. So how is citizenship legally defined? What are the principles that every nation state uses to determine who is a citizen? Well, there are two. The first, jus soli, which means the right of the land. If you were born in a country, you have that country's citizenship. And jus sanguinis, the right of the blood or inheritance. If your parents, or in some cases your grandparents or great-grandparents, were a citizen of a country, then you have that citizenship. And pretty much every nation state uses one or the other. Some nation states, like the United States, at least for now, use both, but oftentimes it's more jus sanguinis than jus soli. Well, so what understanding or definition of citizenship can help us to create an ethical identity and framework for governing our world? Well, I would say we can use those same two legal principles to determine that we are all world citizens. So we look at jus soli and we say all human beings are born on planet Earth. The land is the earth. So this principle affirms that we're world citizens. And jus sanguinis, the right of the blood. All human beings are born of human parents. We are human in our DNA. So that makes us world citizens by birth and in fact. But everyone also has the right to choose your own political allegiance. You can claim world citizenship in addition to any other status that you have as a valid legal status. Now, you might think that world citizenship is a utopian dream or an identity that might not exist for hundreds of years. Actually, the concept of world citizenship dates back to at least 6000 BCE in ancient Hindu texts. But there's also been many philosophers and political activists who've considered themselves to be world citizens, classically, such as Socrates, Diogenes, or Thomas Paine, who call themselves citizens of the world, who saw the world as their country. Of course, civil rights activist Dr. King, poet and activist Maya Angelou, they saw themselves as world citizens. Down at the bottom right corner, that's Catherine Dunham. She was World Service Authority's World Cultural Commissioner for many years. Was a Haitian rights activist. She even created her own dance move in the 1940s and became famous for that. Then Tatyana Mamanova, she's a Russian women's rights activist and for many years had a journal called Women and Earth. Rigoberto Menchu, who is a Guatemalan indigenous peace activist, Nobel Peace Prize winner. And all three of those individuals had world passports too. Then there's Gary Davis in the bottom right corner, who really created the modern world citizenship movement back in 1948 when he gave up his US citizenship in favor of world citizenship and became world famous for having done so. But even people like President Barack Obama twice called himself a citizen of the world. When he gave a speech in Berlin right before his presidency, he called himself that. And then also, even a few years after he was US president, he called himself a citizen of the world. Well, so why is world citizenship in comparison to national citizenship, an ethical identity and framework that can help us to govern our world peacefully and sustainably? Well, national citizenship is exclusive. It keeps people out. It separates people. It builds walls. It creates enemies. And it divides up and harms the planet. World citizenship, on the other hand, is inclusive. It brings people together. It affirms that our rights and duties belong to each of us and exist wherever we find ourselves. It reaffirms that human beings belong to the earth as environmental stewards rather than owning it. And it recognizes the rights of the earth and the other beings with whom we share this world. World citizenship is a unifying and universal rights affirming identity. Well, so why is the view of one earth and us as world citizens so important? Well, it's about creating that ethical and holistic system that includes everyone and everything, rather than a system that excludes or some in favor of others. It's about creating a common identity or citizenship and a common system of principles that we can call the global rule of law. Well, okay, so what are some next steps that you can be involved in to help us build this ethical identity and governing system based on world citizenship? Well, one way is if you know some students who are in high school or college, you can mention that that is Global Citizens for Global Solutions and World Service Authority co-sponsoring the launching of World Citizen Clubs. And you can let these students know this opportunity. It's a student-run club, which is a space where young adults can engage in issues that they're passionate about, like climate change, inequity, poverty, and better systems for governing our world. They can learn to become world peacemakers. World Service Authority also offers legal and communications internships. You could watch the film, The World is My Country. This documentary is about the world citizenship movement. It's introduced by the actor Martin Sheen. And every Wednesday, you could go to watch or listen to the People Powered Planet podcast, which is created by the director and producer of that film, The World is My Country. Or you could even read Gary Davis's memoir, My Country is the World, which he tells his stories about how he traveled the world as a stateless world citizen. And then finally, you could identify yourself as a world citizen, whether you get a world passport or you register officially, legally, and politically as a world citizen. You should know that you do not give up any other allegiance or identity when you do so. You simply are adding that additional awareness and affirmation of your rights and duties to humanity and the earth. Well, so if you have any questions, you can go to our website, worldcitizengov.org, or you can email us to info@worldcitizengov.org. And so I'd like to leave you with a few questions. What are your experiences with your citizenship and identity? Has your citizenship ever been in question? Has your identity ever caused you to be discriminated against? How does your citizenship and identity make you feel? And then I'd simply like to end with the comment, through world citizenship, we can achieve our rights and fulfill our duties. We can build a peaceful, just, sustainable, and united world. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Brilliant presentation. So our next speaker is Dr. Emlyn Koster. Emlyn is an Emlyn is an Earth human ecosystem synthesist. Born in Suez Canal Zone, he has UK, Canadian, and US citizenship. His honours include chairmanship of the Geological Association of Canada during its 50th anniversary, and his appointments include honorary professor in the Institute of Evolutionary Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, I hope I said that correctly, which is near the UNESCO Cradle of Humankind World Heritage Site. I'm pleased to hand over to Emlyn to expound on your article, Toward an Earth-Human Ecosystem. Emlyn, take it away, please.
Well, thank you, James and Rebecca, for welcoming my contribution to what I think is a very timely "what next?" issue of Mondial. Just to add a sentence of introduction, I'm a publicly minded geologist, and I'm offering a holistic recommendation in response to the increasing disconnects between planet Earth's disrupted natural state and the world's contested cultural and political state. Two quotes to begin with. In 2015, 10 years ago, the world's leading medical journal, Lancet, warned, and I quote, "The concept of planetary health is based on the understanding that human health and human civilization depend on flourishing natural systems and the wise stewardship of those natural systems. However, they said, natural systems are being degraded to an extent unprecedented in human history." We can skip forward to 2019 when, as you may recall, since the word existential is often thrown into news headlines and articles, it was before the pandemic began that dictionary.com chose that word as its word of the year to define and to capture, as they said, a sense of grappling with the survival, both literally and figuratively, of our planet, our loved ones, and our ways of life, and to inspire us to ask big questions about who we are and what our purpose is in the face of the various challenges. So my briefing recaps some major steps in the pure to applied transformation of geology, the science which stems from the Greek geo, meaning earth, logos, meaning scientific study of. And I'll start in 1788, when a Scottish doctor and naturalist by the name of James Hutton remarked in his theory of the earth that there is no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. That's how his book on the theory of the earth ended, with that sentence. This became interpreted as the present is the key to the past, or if you prefer, the past is the key to the present. Well, that held until the late 20th century, when we became to know that that principle was only partly true. It's true for forces from the Earth's interior, like volcanoes and earthquakes, but it's not true for the surface environments and the atmosphere of the planet. So we can skip forward to 1800 or thereabouts, when the Prussian explorer and naturalist Alexander von Humboldt deduced, and I quote, that nature would exist without humanity. But he pointed out importantly, and more importantly, one say in today's world, that humanity would not exist without nature. Then we can skip forward to the quote that I begin my article in Mondial with, 1950, when the British astronomer Fred Hoyle predicted, and I quote, that once a photograph of the Earth taken from outside is available, we shall, in an emotional sense, acquire an additional dimension. He said, let the sheer isolation of the Earth become plain for every man, whatever his nationality or creed, and a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. And I think he added that this is not a distant development, and this not so distant development may well be for good, as it must necessarily and increasingly have the effect of exposing the futility of nationalistic strife. Well, I'm afraid none of that prediction has come true. And we can skip forward to 1969, a moment that many of you may remember, when Apollo landed on the moon, and we heard the declaration of one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This was not about the fragile planet with its wafer-thin atmosphere, as the astronauts and many others would comment, but it was about the significant leap forward in space technology. And so we come to the next year, 1970, the first Earth Day, where millions of people demonstrated their concern about environmental degradation. In the 1970s, we had the ever-popular Gaia hypothesis that was focused on the life of the Earth, that life needed to be much better understood as a holistic, interconnected entity. In the 1980s, the Royal Society of Canada, in its compendium called Planet Under Stress, remarked in its introduction, and I quote, "The human being is an animal that has moved out of ecological balance with its environment. We are now faced with a task that is more difficult than anything ever contemplated, which is to decide how we may continue to live on this small planet." So in the 1980s, NASA made the decision that the Earth needed to be viewed as an Earth system, and that is that the Earth comprises a series of concentric enclosing shells of the air, of water, of ice, of life, of soil and rock, and that we should give each of these their due names: atmosphere, hydrosphere, cryosphere, biosphere, pedosphere, and lithosphere. This is the geological terminology. And so we then come to 2000, 25 years ago, when the atmospheric scientist and Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen drew attention to the damage to the outer atmosphere, to the protective ozone layer, due to human use of aerosols. And then in breakthrough articles, including one called The Geology of Mankind, he proposed the term Anthropocene as shorthand for humanity's intensifying disruption of the Earth system. Then we can come forward to only 10 years ago, 2015, when the United Nations unanimously, a rare moment, perhaps with no parallel, unanimously declared transforming our world with 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 targets. But not all was well. 7 years later, in 2023, the UN Secretary General announced, and I quote, "At the midway point on our way to 2030, the SDGs are in deep trouble. A preliminary assessment of the roughly 140 targets with data show that only 12% are on track. Close to half, those showing progress, are moderately or severely off track, and some 30% have either seen no movement or regressed below their 2015 baseline. If ever," he said, "there was an illumination of the short-sightedness of the prevailing economic and political systems, it is the ratcheting up of war on nature. The potential for science, technology, and innovation to be applied to the SDGs is vastly untapped and institutional." And so we come to the term that my colleagues Phil Gibbard from University Cambridge and Mark Maslin from University College London have proposed in an article in the journal Geoethics in 2024 of the Earth-Human Ecosystem, which is in the title of this presentation. It focuses on interactions among the shells with their competing natural and unnatural forces, hence Earth and human, and through an ecological lens, hence the addition of ecosystem. So this is the proposed superior term to just saying Earth system alone, that we need to talk of an Earth-human ecosystem. And so the word Anthropocene arises, and it's really the post-Ice Age intensifying, ongoing impact of humanity, its 8.2 billion citizens on the natural shells of the Earth. So let's just sort of then go into the cultural definition, which I also go into in the paper. You know, most people don't really respectfully have a clue that the Earth comprises 2.2 million species. 2.2 million species. We're one, Homo sapiens. About 6,500 of those 2.2 million only are mammals. And of those, only 6% are primates. As many as 20 human species used to exist, including Homo neanderthalensis, until about 40,000 years ago. So when humanity first started to migrate with indigenous people out of Central Africa, there were 60 or so thousand years ago, there was still another species, Homo neanderthalensis, occupying Europe and Asia. And so here's part of my offered definition of nature, of culture, I should say, as I move towards the close of this briefing. And I'm now quoting a paragraph in the article. "The earliest indigenous people settled where their journeys ended out of Africa, beyond ice sheet and ocean barriers, forming the first nations with their sustained traditions, intergenerational communications, and environmentally sustainable lifestyles. Today's culturally diverse indigenous peoples total some 470 million people in over 90 countries. Early Western cultures typically imposed unsustainable practices through conquest, exploitation, colonialism, and colonization of regions in other continents. New technologies which began in Western Europe soon permeated all cultures. Across today's fractious world, with 8.2 billion people, diasporas are scattered subsets of residual initial populations. Social anthropology, sociology, and the humanities are focused on evolving characteristics with surging interests in injustice and traditional ways of knowing. The heritage, the behaviors, the artifacts, the norms, the rituals, the ceremonies, and the institutions of all indigenous and Western and Eastern peoples comprise the mosaic of humanity in a global Anthropocene context. I'm going to end on 2 points. One is that the world is dominated when it comes to environmental knowledge about climate change. But climate change is a very limited view of the problems facing the planet. We know it dominates the annual COP conferences attended by up to 100,000 people, often in oil-rich countries. But climate change is far more than the Paris Accord of 1.8 degrees centigrade of warming. It's about record-setting extreme weather. It's about latitudinal and altitudinal shifting of ecosystems. It's about disrupted food chains and the virosphere, the other layer of the Earth's surface, which contains viral diseases. The pandemic of COVID-19 was widely thought to have been exacerbated by climate change. It refers to the melting of ice sheets and glaciers and ocean level rising. It refers to ocean warming and polar sea ice melting. It refers to the reduced carrying capacities of the planet to the human population. So here are two concluding sentiments, somewhat soulfully, which I also put into the end of the article. So in his acclaimed book, Cosmos...
Emlyn, would you mind if you wrapped up briefly?
I will. I've got one quote left. Thank you. Cosmos, Carl Sagan mused, when Voyager 1 was about 4 billion miles away, the spacecraft was departing our planetary neighborhood for the fringes of the solar system. It turned around for the last time at its home planet. He wrote, look again at that dot, that pale blue dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. I'll stop there. Thanks very much, James.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emlyn. Fascinating. I'm sure that will elicit many questions. We will move speedily on. Next, I'm pleased to introduce David Wolcombe. David is the founder of Peace Child International. He has championed youth engagement for more than 40 years and specializes, in making complex topics understandable to young people and others. Among his contributions to youth engagement in the vital issues of our time include David's contribution to writing and producing the play Peace Child, the creation of the children's edition of the Rio 21 Agenda, Rescue Mission, Planet Earth, and the organization of 6 World Youth Congresses. David now works as a consultant on youth employment, citizen diplomacy, and climate change issues for a number of organizations in the United Kingdom and globally. He stood 3 times as a Green Party candidate in Hertfordshire, England, and represents the East Herts Local Council. I imagine that means more to me than it does to many of you. Finally, David, I know that you're keen to update us on the developments since you wrote your article, the UN's liquidity crisis, radical thinking. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for having me amongst this distinguished company here. I feel as a humble author and counsellor, local counsellor in far too distinguished company to really offer very much. But the play Peace Child, James, is actually what we're focusing on this year. Back in 1980, I wrote the original Peace Child play with a bunch of young people who imagined the world without the Cold War. And it told the story of how Soviet and American young people became friends, and because they were friends, they didn't need nuclear weapons, and they tried to persuade their presidents to become friends, which they finally succeeded in doing. And that play was performed at the United Nations in 1989, and 3 months after that performance, the Berlin Wall failed, and the story that the children had first told in 1981 actually became a reality. But oh boy, how has that situation spectacularly unraveled in the last few months? It's very depressing to see after 40 years of doing this work that the United Nations that we dreamed of back then has not been strengthened in the way that we'd hoped, but actually has become considerably weaker. And that just sort of emphasizes to me that we have to keep working at this, working at the idea of global governance. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're starting these World Citizens Clubs, because that's what we all need to encourage young people to join and be inspired by. But to come to the article, if I can share my screen, I just want to run through some of the sorry, let me go back.
I've just made you a co-host, David, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. There we go. So yes, that's the article, and as promised, I'd like to bring it up to date, because just my own very personal experience of how broke the United Nations is. When we did our performance in the General Assembly in 1989, we didn't have to pay a cent for renting the hall. As we plan the UN Day concert this year, we're told that we have to pay over $100,000 just for the renting of the UN space. That's before we erect any stage or lights or anything like that. So that's because the UN is in this desperate liquidity crisis, which the Secretary General in his letter of January last year said we now anticipate running out of all cash by August 2024. Well, clearly they didn't, but the problem is, as we all know, the non-payment of dues. And as of today, 67 member states have paid their dues. And I show you that because James and I should be very proud that the United Kingdom was one of the first to pay this year. But then if we move on, look at the top 10 providers. That's the assessed contributions, which I mentioned in the article. And obviously the United States and China are the two far and away the biggest contributors to the UN. And if you look at the non-payers, you'll see that both China and the United States are non-payers, which is why the UN ended last year with 1.5 billion unpaid regular budget assessments. Now, how can you resolve that? These just say this is the regular budget assessment, but this is the peacekeeping assessments, which are similarly unpaid by the United States and China. And how the UN can continue to operate, let alone be strengthened and become a stronger force in the world, when it is that short of cash, is obviously a huge problem. And the purpose of the article was to look at the different solutions. And just to run through them, the major problem is now that although the UN is spending more money than ever before, 74 billion last year, most of those funds are earmarked for special programs, and it is the excess contribution to the regular budgets that are really not being covered. And so therefore, several academic think tanks have come up with solutions. And this idea of delivering as one has been around for a long, long time and seeks to solve the problem that there are 3 UN agencies responsible for UN and for food and agriculture, 6 for international trade, 29 agencies have program on water, and 4 have programs on maternal health. That kind of duplication is obviously very wasteful, and one hopes that the UN will actually get its act together and solve that. But I think the most promising of the solutions that I looked at was to follow the European Commission model, where budget contributions are actually taken automatically from government budgets as a result of membership. And that's something that maybe the UN should look at. Obviously, the Tobin tax has been around for 40 years, and we all rather love the idea of a Robin Hood tax on international share trading and monetary exchanges. And that sort of money could go into a United Nations fund. And then there's the Schwarzberg proposal, which is assess member state contributions as a fixed percent of their people's average per capita income. And that's a different method of assessment from the one I showed you at the beginning. And it's actually a very intelligent one. And that's, you know, something that, again, these solutions are out there. But for me, one of the things that was absolutely gobsmacking is that in Article 19 of the UN Charter, countries that do not pay their dues for more than 2 years are then denied the right to vote in the General Assembly. Well, we in the business world have to settle our invoices within 30 days net, usually. So the fact that the UN allows its member states to go 2 years without punishing them for non-payment is breathtaking. And that's one thing that I think should be looked at. But the other thing that I talk about in the article, which is slightly fanciful, is we're talking a lot about carbon trading to reduce to carbon emissions around the world. And that is something that maybe the United Nations could monetize itself by managing. And the UN has been very bad at monetizing itself. It's not allowed to collect taxes. Only the International Maritime Organization actually collects money from licenses that it issues. Every other agency of the United Nations depends on voluntary contributions. So that's not a very great way of running a business. There are other ways, and the thing that I feel most strongly about is that we need to create a UN that works, a UN that actually does save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, that does deliver education for all, health for all, etc., and actually does deliver a world free of nuclear weapons, which was actually the main subject of the very first UN General Assembly meeting in London in 1946. 5 months after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, everyone's mind was focused on nuclear disarmament. 80 years later, that issue is still very, very present in our world, but actually has been pushed to the back of the public agenda, and it needs to come forward and be really looked at. And just to sort of close, to go back to the Peace Child story, the Peace Child story is challenging young people to come up with viable solutions to global problems. We've done projects in South Africa, in Central America, in India and Pakistan, and in inner cities and suburbs, bringing together kids from conflict zones or areas where there are disagreements. And this year, we're bringing together young people from the P5 nations in a series of Peace Child performances that look actually at what the Summit of the Future and its Declaration on Future Generations decided last year in the summit, and to try and come up with a story of how they would create a United Nations that really does work in their lifetimes. So hopefully that story, which we're developing with these young people over the course of this year, will deliver a self-fulfilling prophecy as that original Peace Child did back in the 1980s. It's a stretch. It's a very, very hard thing to do. And if any of you have any ideas or would like to contribute thoughts on what those young people who are coming together this summer should be thinking about, please do contact me, and I'll put my my email address in the chat. But that's where I think I'd like to finish, James, if that's all right.
Perfectly timed. Thank you, David. You speak to vital issues. I will now open up for a first round of questions. As usual, I will ask you to raise your physical or virtual hands to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. I'll come to you on a first come, first served basis. I would like to ask you just for one question or comment during this round each. And if you could, please be brief. We'll keep this to 10 to 15 minutes so we can move on to the second round of discussants. Thanks. So who would I see? First hand I see is Virginia Swain, and then I'll cycle through to see who else has got questions. Virginia, would you like to ask a question?
So thank you so much. And David, it's wonderful to see you again after so long. It's been like 30 years or something, hasn't it? But I just wanted to say how important it is that we consider one major factor of why the UN isn't working, which is we have to move to common interest beyond self-interest. And I think without that stretching of the goal to common interests, we're going to fail. And most countries are so nationalistic right now, including ours. How can we do that? How can we move to common interest unless we involve we the people?
Thank you. Would anybody else like to ask a question, or should we take that to the speakers? Shirley, I see Lee. I don't know if you're waving your hand or if you're chatting. No, okay. Emlyn, please come back.
A question for David. Flowing from my remarks, David, is, as I mentioned, as a point along the way, is the failure of the UN SDGs in their Transforming Our Planet 2015-2030 vision. There's a lot in science land out there. There's a lot of skepticism and a sense of failure that this siloed piecemeal approach of 17 goals, firstly about the human condition and then about the environmental condition, that not only are countries not paying attention to them, but intrinsically it's a failed concept to begin with. And there's been so much identity with the UN, with the SDG process. Organizations are framing their structure around them. Research is trying to pursue them. Museums are trying to illustrate them, et cetera, that it really is a very disappointing status report from the UN that this whole notion that was hailed as a breakthrough in 2015 has actually been a failure. And that's why I'm suggesting that there must be this more holistic approach in terms of an Earth-human ecosystem, holistically, continuously, interdependently, not in the form of 17 piecemeal siloed goals.
David, yes, if you'd like to respond.
Can I just come back on that? First of all, Virginia, yes. Can I say that the whole purpose of this Peace Child is to explore things on which people have to agree in order and have to collaborate in order to get solutions. If we focus on Gaza, if we focus on Ukraine, if we focus on Taiwan, we know there are going to be disagreements. Whereas if we focus on the issues that Emlyn was talking about there is a chance we have, well, not just a chance, we have to agree on dealing with these issues. And the United Nations is the perfect focus of that. And thank you, Emlyn, for being brave enough to share my view that the SDGs are a bit of a failure. As you probably know, the United Nations Foundation has encouraged its youth to focus almost entirely on the SDGs, which the young people that I work with here, the Peace Child Youth Leadership Group, have found rather dispiriting and not particularly engaging, because the holistic approach is absolutely the one that we have to deal with. And that's why we spent a lot of time working on the Declaration on Future Generations last year, because that idea of being a good ancestor is what actually defines what we must all do. And I haven't read your article yet, forgive me, I will, so I can't comment directly on that. But if you know anything about the history of the United Kingdom, the Victorians built the water treatment plants, they built the sewers, they built the health systems on which we still depend. And I try to get young people to look back at all that stuff, that investment, which is helping us today, 150 years later. That's what being a good ancestor is about. And we'd like to see young people take on board the idea of being an ancestor for good, for future generations, and that be the sort of program that drives forward acknowledgement and study and development of the Declaration for Future Generations, because we hope that document, like the Declaration on Human Rights, will spawn a whole library of legislation and guidance on how we can ensure that we as citizens of today do not pass on to the citizens of the future the hollowed out husk of a dying planet, as they say in the Peace Child story. So that's why I think I entirely agree with the approach that looking beyond the SDGs is what we all ought to be starting to do now. Thank you.
Terrific. So Donna made a question in the chat, but Donna, I assume it's okay, we can answer that in the chat. If not, if you'd like to bring it to the table, just raise your hand. John Blasto, welcome. You have a question or comment? Winston, I will come to you next.
Thank you. Need to turn my mic on. Very quick follow on to David's comment that it would help funding the UN if we had a UN that actually worked. And just maybe a thought for the book club here. I don't know, maybe it's already happened. I don't know if you've invited Augusto Lopez Claros, who convened the team that drafted the second charter, to talk about the second charter.
Not on the second charter. We had him and Maya and Arthur Dahl on their previous book, but we would love to have him again on the second.
There's a meeting with him coming up in Madrid in a month's time or something, so I'll maybe push him in that direction if you guys are open to it. And Heber Ali, who is chairing the Impact Coalition that's trying to sell the second charter around the world.
Yep.
And just in that context, Trump isn't maybe being very helpful for most of our work, but if he subscribed to Milton Friedman's view that you need a good crisis to bring about the reform we seek, then maybe Trump is pushing us in that direction.
Gallows humor. Sorry, Rebecca?
Yeah, sorry, John, there's a question in the chat from Lynn. If WFA, I think you mean the World Federalist Association Institute for Global Policy, is still in existence. John, would you like to answer that before we move on to our next question?
As far as I know, it is. I chair it, and as far as I know, it still exists. But if you know otherwise, please do let me know.
Very good, thank you. Winston.
Isn't this actually the evolution of it? Citizens for Global Solutions isn't.
CGS is the US-based member organization of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy. And our technical name is the World Federalist Association doing business as Citizens for Global Solutions. So we're very proud to be a part of a global family dedicated to democratic world federalism. But I'm sorry, I'm interrupting others who had their hands up, including I saw Lee.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Rebecca. Winston, and then I'll come to Lee.
Yes, I was interested in, am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes. I was interested in Virginia's question and comment and the response to it. It seems to me that any effort directed at unveiling a sort of common interests among human beings. We've been talking about global citizenship, for example, and holistic approach to things, must simultaneously aim at a subversion of a culture, and I emphasize culture, that speaks to a dualism in everything we do. Nothing that defines what we do today, we can just touch at nationalism, for example, and where the world is currently, is without the effect of that dualism. So I think we ought to think of a countercultural assault to be effective here. Certainly the idea of a world federal government is very much part of that subversion. But I hope we will look at it more broadly in this cultural sense. And Koster's effort and the focus on what is the meaning of climate change, I think is a good effort in that direction.
Wonderful, thank you, Winston. And I can't find Lee in my list. I can see Donna waving a hand and I see Lee. Lee, would you like to go next? Donna, was that you? No, it was not. Okay, Lee, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay.
Welcome.
Actually, it's Ron and Lee who are attending together, and it's Ron's question, and directed primarily to Emlyn Koster. In the 3rd of January issue of Science, in the Policy Forum section, is an article titled "Solar Geoengineering Research Faces Geopolitical Deadlock." And as we continue to fail in our response to climate change and the emissions of fossil fuels continue to pollute the atmosphere, and climate becomes worse and more difficult to deal with, geoengineering, such as introducing aerosols into the upper atmosphere to control the energy budget coming in and out of the earth, becomes more of a likelihood and more of a necessity. And yet, only a small number of countries are major actors in that science. And there is no worldwide effective mechanism to make the decisions either on the trial runs of different geoengineering projects or who makes the decisions when one country takes the lead in the science and the project affects the entire world. So I'm wondering whether you could comment on that, Emlyn.
Well, thank you. I'm not familiar with the article, but I'll check it out. But my comment in general, which I hope is useful, is that I don't think the world can afford not to experiment with sort of geo-scale engineering projects. But it can't be, given their uncertainty and skepticism of attempts, to be the main thing that we think is a solution. I think that I'm going to hold up a book that I heartily recommend consideration called Nomad Sanctuary by Gaia Vince, subtitle How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. I think we've got to sort of take reality face on and do many things, as the previous speaker said, that we can't have a single solution to any of these giant Earth-wide problems, that we need to, yes, experiment with climate engineering. I'm familiar, because of my background in the Research Council world, with the attempts to seed thunderstorms with silver iodide to promote their dropping of smaller raindrops rather than crop damaging hailstones. You know, this was also tried, but is very difficult to succeed because of the unpredictability of the pathway of tornadoes and hurricanes systems. So yes to the experimentation appetite, but not, please, only. We've got.
Apologies, that was my mistake. So I believe there are no further questions, in which case I will thank everyone for their questions. I will thank our three speakers, David Welcome, Emlyn Koster, and David Gallup. Brilliantly interesting. And we'll come to our second round of speakers a little bit closer to home. Our next speaker is Hannah Fields. Hannah is Communications Officer at CGS. She's also a Communications and Digital Content Specialist with over a decade of experience working in nonprofits, global health, and higher education. She supported organizations such as the Mayo Clinic and the American Academy for Political and Social Sciences with editorial projects, digital content management, and a range of communication support. Hannah, I'm pleased to hand over to you to discuss your article, A Tale of Two Summits, Civil Society's Role in the UN's Summit of the Future. Hannah.
Thanks, James. I feel like my article now seems a bit depressing now that we see civil society under attack, mostly here in the US, and how it's affecting everyone globally. And it almost seems like there's a shadow over the events that happened, because I do remember CGS was part of a session at the Action Days, which was Room for Optimism, a precondition for success in challenging times. And it may be useful to listen to that again so that maybe we can find some hope. And my article really just gives an overview of how this event was slated to be a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was supposed to really change the way the UN thinks and what they do, but it really kind of fell short in that. The action days were great. There were 10,000 organizations there. They were involved, but I feel like the UN is still so disconnected from what civil society wants and how they want to be involved. I did interview Heba Ali and got her thoughts on the events, and she said that it would help if the UN would realize we are in a crisis globally, whether that's through the armed conflicts that are happening, our environment, and other events. And if the UN would listen to civil society and work with them, multilateralism could really thrive. Because I do feel the UN tends to be a bit disconnected on what's happening on different levels. And it would be nice to see civil society and the UN work together. And really that, the tale of two summits, it's where the UN and civil society, even though they were meant to be connected with the action days and the actual event, it still seemed like two different events. And there wasn't really that bridge to the good changes that could happen. And if you look, for example, in the final documents, they did water down the language of environmental governments, which are actions 9 and 10, if you want to read those. They removed Action 32, which would have facilitated critical tech transfers to developing countries while safeguarding those intellectual property rights. And they also cut the term emergency platforms, which was Action 54. And that's a huge setback, especially when they had the chance to convene state and non-state actors to global crises, which we're especially seeing in Palestine. So I don't have a lot to add. It was more just, this was an overview. And I think, as we approach the 80th anniversary in 2025 this year, and we have a new Secretary General taking office in 2027, and they're supposed to regroup in 2028 to see if any progress has happened. I think they're really going to need to work harder and turn to civil society and really protect civil society as we move forward under this new administration. And as John said, it would be nice to have a UN that works, and it needs to start working so that we can do better by, just humanity in the world. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Hannah. Short and to the point. I will then move on to our final speaker, Rebecca Shute. Well, many of you will already know Rebecca well. For the benefit of those amongst you who may not, Rebecca Shute is the editor-in-chief of Mondial. She's also the executive director of Citizens for Global Solutions. She convenes on a pro bono basis the Washington Working Group for the ICC and the Impact Coalition on International Judicial Institutions. I will also say that she formerly worked at the International Criminal Court, so she's well placed to explain the potential impact of ICC sanctions. So Rebecca, over to you to provide your, I'm sure, much desired analysis of recently levied sanctions on the ICC. The floor's yours.
Thank you so much, James. And before I commence, I know we have an embarrassment of riches with the authors who have so kindly offered their time and generously their wisdom and their expertise. But I also would like to shout out to a few other authors who are featured in this issue Jocelyn Getchen-Kestenbaum writes on rectifying the Rome Statute and draft articles on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity to include the slave trade. This is something that's going to be incredibly live this year. Slavery and the slave trade have been overlooked in international law for as long as international law has existed. We also had our student essay contest winner, Amaryllis Torres Nunes, who we sent to the Ventatone seminar in Italy, and who wrote on addressing the crisis of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. And we have book recommendations, including by Hannah and also by Erica Wilson. And Matt McDonough, the vice chair of CGS, has written a beautiful memoriam to our former National Advisory Council member, Randy Keller. So while we did not have room on this agenda for all of those wonderful folks to be here, as well as David Gallup's co-author on his article, Alexander McIsaac, who's the executive director of our counterpart, WFM Canada, I commend to your attention all of their work. And I'll also just highlight for those of you who might have just downloaded individual articles that cover art that you see is by a Syrian artist, and you can learn more about it if you download the full PDF and see in the back that this is a juxtaposition of Gustav Klimt's famous The Kiss painting over the ruins of Homs and in Syria. And so we thought that this really captured this moment of, are we looking at light? Are we looking at darkness? What comes next? So with that being said, one of the questions that James put to all the authors is what compelled us to write our various contributions to this issue of Mondial. And the fact of the matter is I really didn't have a choice. It was an existential threat to not only the International Criminal Court, but an entire community that is gathered around international justice and human rights issues. And so what I do in the article is I trace backwards a bit and situate the executive order that was promulgated a couple of weeks ago within a years-long fight to try to uphold the independence and autonomy of this particular international judicial institution, but in fact, international judicial institutions writ large. And James, in my introduction, mentioned that CGS, along with WFM, who I'm very glad John is here to represent today, is the co-convener of an impact coalition on international judicial institutions. And this ties directly back into the preceding speaker, Hannah's remarks, because these impact coalitions were formed in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, and some of them continue their work today. And so in addition to the ICC being under threat, there have been remarks by the Trump administration and in other corridors that lead us to believe that the International Court of Justice might be vulnerable as well. So just a quick recap of what the sanctions regime is and why it matters and why we should care. The International Criminal Court, of which CGS was integral to founding as part of the coalition for the ICC, was the project that began actually not in the 90s, but way back was contemplated even before the UN Charter was promulgated. When the PCIJ, the forerunner of the International Court of Justice, came into existence, there was the notion that it might need, which has a jurisdiction over disputes between states, there was the notion that crimes that shock the conscience of humanity might need an international body able to adjudicate over criminal responsibility of persons. It took 50 some odd years after those discussions around the UN Charter until we have finally in the 90s, the formation of a group of, at that point, 24 civil society organizations who led to the existence of what we now know to be the ICC. And a couple years later, once the appropriate number of signatories had signed up, it began its work. And as a champion of the International Criminal Court, it's incumbent upon us in civil society also to be constructive critics. It's a human-made invention, and therefore certainly not without its flaws. And thanks to the apparatus and the procedures and the relationships developed between the CICC and that institution, we as civil society have on a regular basis the opportunity to weigh in, to air grievances, to contribute to the continued evolution of what is very much an inchoate and ever evolving, ever maturing body. Coming back to sanctions. In 2020, with the first Trump administration, we had the deposit of sanctions against the International Criminal Court by executive order on September 2nd, 2020. And I remember this day very well because it's the day after my birthday and the day that I became the co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the ICC. And we became very busy thereafter. The Washington Working Group for the ICC was originally a product of the late John Washburn, who was known to many of you. And it began as a very informal, twice-monthly luncheon discussion in DC about US relationships with the court. And it was a counterpoint to the larger American branch of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, which currently doesn't exist. All of this due to the leadership and under the guidance of the great Bill Pace, who also was the executive director of WFM for many years, as you all many of you would be aware. So we kicked into gear in 2020, but those sanctions, which were limited to the prosecutor at the time, Madam Fatou Bensouda, and a senior member of her team who wasn't very well known in the public eye, but was a citizen of Lesotho, which was not going to necessarily retaliate against the Trump administration. They were only in place for 4 months before they were mooted by the change of administration to Biden, and Biden rescinded the executive order. Then over the course of 2023 and 2024, we faced enormous challenges coming from the legislative branch of government with a bill that passed in the previous Congress, the House, passed again almost immediately upon this Congress taking this Congress's inauguration in 2025, and then very narrowly failed a Senate vote. Although, as I write, I included the last minute in the article. We're not out of the woods yet in terms of legislation sanctioning the court. What are sanctions and why do they matter? Sanctions are tools normally deployed against kleptocrats or war criminals, the baddest of the bad. They're very important in the U.S. foreign policy arsenal, as in the arsenal of other countries and entities like the European Union that seek to separate individuals from their assets, freeze their assets, and in some cases put travel restrictions upon them. Now, by executive order, we have that we have an executive order with a 60-day period for review during which individual designations will be made to ICC officials and perhaps collaborators. And the first such has already been made against the prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan. This is not a surprising designation. But as some of you who have been with me in the course of the last weeks and months know, we still are facing a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. And I want to have a special shout out to Winston, who joined us yesterday for our Washington Working Group for the ICC's monthly meeting, where we had a sanctions expert really walk through the EO, the executive order, in granular detail with us. This is not what that article seeks to do. I am not a sanctions expert. This seeks to situate the sanctions regime within a broader context of the U.S. relationship with the ICC. And to that point, I'll also just note the contributions and the mentorship that I personally have received from one of our National Advisory Council members, Ambassador David Sheffer, who was the first Ambassador at Large for War Crimes, which is now styled Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. We'll see if that office continues in this administration, whose name is signed to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. As everybody, I think, is aware, the United States is not a state party to the ICC, but we did sign the treaty literally in the 11th hour, after 11 p.m. on the last day that it was available for signature at the UN premises in New York. And that's David's handwriting. And it's his contention that the United States always meant to become a state party and fully ratify. And that what was holding us up at that point was qualms about jurisdiction over U.S. persons that should have subsequently been satisfied, like it or not, by the passage of the U.S. Service Members Protection Act. Now, I'll pause here and just also say that this comes at a time, as was alluded to, I think, in the discussion of David Wolcomb's article, where the U.S. foreign assistance and international development community is facing precedented challenges and wholesale dismantling in some cases. And so those of us that work at the intersection of international justice and human rights and development are in a very difficult position. It was incredibly hard for me to finish this article, partly because of this, partly because I'm coming to you live from Washington, D.C. in this environment, in this atmosphere, with many friends and colleagues out of jobs or with our programs and our beneficiaries stranded. But it was also hard because it was a moving target and still is in many respects. I mentioned this 60-day period. We don't know if the window closes after the 60-day period or if a new EO could come out right thereafter. And so all I can say is that it's incumbent upon us that have devoted our lives and careers and vocations to international justice issues to stay in there. And I'm very grateful for those of you many of you who've attended Washington Working Group for the ICC meetings, and some of you have come to our Impact Coalition events. We're very proud to co-lead the Legal Alternatives to War, Law Not War program that upholds the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, as the Pacific means of resolution for disputes between states, so that we do not choose armed conflict in the first instance. And yes, EO is executive order. I apologize for using so many acronyms. Washington is alphabet soup land sometimes. And so I encourage all of you who care about these issues to go to the appropriate places on CGS's website, come to our events, get involved, talk to me, and we'll find out ways that we can in solidarity, join hands and stand against what are, quite frankly, existential threats. Thank you so much, James. I think I went a little bit over time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. It's an issue of concern to all of us, I'm sure. Questions, a second round. First, of course, we had Hannah's article and now Rebecca's. So if any of you have questions either about the Summit of the Future and the follow-up, and perhaps some of our learning from that, or Rebecca's discussion of the ICC. Donna, I see your hand up first, so I will come to you and then I will run through to see if we have any other questions. Donna.
Thank you, James. This has been a really interesting book club. Thanks to James and Rebecca and Hannah, everyone, for making this happen. Rebecca, I really appreciated your article and was excited to see the lawsuits against Trump. I have to admit, it's the first time I smiled in a while, I think. But in your article, you mentioned that like Sadat v. Trump and OSJI v. Donald J. Trump. So you said the lawsuits might bear revisiting now. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about the merits of the case and how they're similar or dissimilar.
Great question. Thank you so much, Donna. So Donna is referring to two suits that were lodged in two different federal districts of U.S. court in 2020, challenging the 2020 sanctions. And one of them was led by the named plaintiff was our National Advisory Council member, Layla Sadat, and was supported by the ACLU. and the other had 4 named plaintiffs, all of whom are friends and a Washington Working Group for the ICC members, and was supported by the Open Society Justice Initiative. And the merits of their arguments were that although US citizens normally cannot be sanctioned, put on sanctions list, there have been exceptions, such as Islamic charities in the past, but they're quite rare. Secondarily, the penalties for cooperating with sanctioned individuals, which can range up to $1 million and 20 years in jail, imperil our freedom of speech under our First Amendment rights. And so that was the basis on which these 2 suits brought claim. And in one of them, the OSJI case, there was a preliminary injunction. So the judge found at least enough plausibility to have temporary restraint on the conduct. But then they were mooted when the administration changed and the Biden administration came in. This is very, very ripe right now. And yes, there is strategic litigation being contemplated yet again. I know that the organizations are not ready to go public. They're contemplating slightly different classes of plaintiffs than before. One of the cases previously, the one that Layla led, the class plaintiff was dual citizens and looking if they would face sanctions threat, and the other was human rights defenders and legal professionals who cooperate with court. And so, yes, I've been contacted personally, actually, to play matchmaker with some potential plaintiffs for strategic litigation upcoming, and that I think you'll start seeing that very soon. At the same time that there will be strategic litigation challenging the executive order, there also is the need, unfortunately, for counsel for those who may be liable or vulnerable. And that's different than strategic litigation. Folks like the Darfur Women's Action Group, folks like the Center for Constitutional Rights that work with victims and survivors and collaborate, therefore, with the Office of the Prosecutor, where the prosecutor is now on a sanctions list. They are potentially vulnerable. And, these are folks who have been nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes. They're amazing advocates. And likewise, behind the scenes, we've been playing a little bit of a matchmaker, trying to get them individual organizational counsel on their vulnerability. I hope that answers the question.
Hey, Rebecca, thank you. Now, I don't see any other hands up. Oh, I do. I see 2 hands up. Sorry, I hadn't scrolled. David first, and then come to Virginia. David, welcome.
Thank you very much. I just want to again thank you, Rebecca, for allowing us to be a part of this book club. I certainly would like to stay. I had not heard of Stuart Patrick's article at the Carnegie Endowment, but having just glanced at it, honestly, Rebecca, what is happening in your town is just beyond belief. But that article is really important to the subjects we're discussing today. And the question I wanted to ask, actually, Hannah, is what kind of follow-up you've been able to do. We all know about the impact coalitions, which are keeping going. Mine on the Declaration on Future Generations is quite active. But we heard talk of some government follow-up. The UK government has been thoroughly supine and moved on to the next thing, which of course is the FFD. And it's like the Summit of the Future never happened. And I'd like to ask you, Rebecca and Hannah, what you think we should be doing to try and remind governments of the breakthrough that we managed to achieve last September and how we can keep it alive in their minds and follow up on it. Thank you.
So I don't know if you know Larry Whitner, but we work on our blog together, and I've been speaking with him about doing some follow-up on this article. One, speaking on how civil society is at risk of, these authoritarian groups coming to power, but also reminding governments and those involved what these impact coalitions are still doing and how they can be involved. So it's kind of like a series on this is what happened and this is how we can move forward. So that's what we're working on right now, and hopefully, writing more about this and still saying these organizations are here. We need to remember that and remember what was done in September so that it's not just I don't want it to be something like a performative act that was taken out and then there's no follow through. So maybe if we keep making statements and reminding them and talking to other people and what they're doing, like Heba, she's been writing quite a bit, and it would be nice to check in with her and go from there. So that's what we're working on. We talked about it briefly about a day or two ago. So that's what I'm working on now. It's doing a series of follow-ups.
Thank you, Hannah. Rebecca, do you have some thoughts?
Sure. Yes, to Lynn's question, my town is Washington, D.C., but I frequently run back up and down to New York, which is my hometown, where I'm originally from, and where we engage with our partners in a great deal of member state advocacy to try to keep the promise of the Pact of the Future and its annexes, the Declaration on Future Generations and the Global Digital Compact. One of the ways in which we do this and the spaces that we do this is through the impact coalitions, of course. We also have bilateral advocacy. And I really have to shout out to the Coalition for the UN We Need, which not only was kind of the galvanizing force behind the impact coalitions, but is continuing in their in the vein of their strategic plan over the next 2 years at least to serve as a fulcrum for civil society to reach member states and also to organize us that, of the, I think, 56 actions in the Pact for the Future and the numerous in the annexes, who is tracking which and which member states are we each engaging with to hold their feet to the fire. One example that I'll give is that the Pact for the Future contemplates UN Security Council reform. It doesn't say what kind, it doesn't say when, it doesn't say where, how, but we're not eager to drop that conversation, and we're not letting member states drop that conversation and that commitment. And so with Heba's leadership at the Coalition for the UN, we need, with our engagement and others, we are bringing to the fore the proposals that we think can gain traction. And I've recently been engaging with the UN associations, a couple of UN associations in the UK, David, one in the Greater London and what do they call it? South London and regions area, and then one in the Northeast. That is putting together a proposal on veto reform that they're bringing to LAMI. And another an engagement with WFM Canada that has had some success with their foreign ministry, bringing together a veto reform proposal. And I won't take up too much time. There is a previous article on the reform of the veto that our friend Professor Jennifer Trahan has written, and I follow and hew very closely to her approach, and happy to speak at further length about that. And also to commend to everybody a short film on the veto that she has produced. And I'll be introducing at the American Society of International Law in about a month. I know we're at time, so I apologize for going over, but I invoked David Wolcomb's name and I saw him come off mute. So I don't know if you're going to respond.
I just was going to mention that meeting about the veto is being run by the LASER group of UNAs in the UK.
I should have remembered LASER. Yes, it's a fun acronym.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, David. So I think last of all, to wrap us up, Virginia, you have your hand raised.
I'd like to thank Hannah and Rebecca and offer a sidebar for Rebecca's mention of John Washburn. John Washburn did a lot to change the self-interest to common interest that Winston and I are very interested in. He invited the Hopi elder, Thomas Branca, to deliver the Hopi prophecy. Thomas had been trying for 40 years to get into the UN to speak. And he was John Washburn that provided the access. And I just wanted to say, I put his speech in the chat. I will send that to you. It's a 20-minute speech well worth listening to in the light of this conversation about America and in the world, as well as his role in making so much happen to get Indigenous voices into the UN.
Thank you, Virginia. So Emlyn, you have your hand raised, and David, you put a comment in the chat, so I'll come to you. So 2 more quick comments or questions, and then we'll bring
James,
ourselves.
thank you. This is just a follow-up to my reference to 2023, when the Secretary General of the UN lamented that the UN had not taken adequate consideration of the input of science. I'm going to flick that as an important footnote and say that as a scientist myself, I know that the scientific establishment has been very lax in not engaging as it should with public and civil society directly. And I'll end this by just recalling the opportunity that arose in the middle part of 2023 with the release of the Oppenheimer film, and the co-authors of the book that stimulated that film, American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, wrote in their book, "It is my hope," I'm quoting, "that Christopher Nolan's stunning new film on Oppenheimer's complicated legacy will initiate a national conversation not only about our existential relationship, there's that word again, to weapons of mass destruction, but also the need in our society for scientists as public intellectuals. As a publicly active geologist involved in this kind of dialogue, I'm acutely aware that I am virtually alone in wanting, as a scientist, to be proactive in this arena, and I'm making it my job to try and spread the enthusiasm for scientists to be engaged in the promotion of their field at the core of global governance."
Thank you, Emlyn. David.
Okay, yeah, just a sort of a final overall comment from my perspective, but also the Gary Davis perspective, you might say. And that is, when we divide ourselves into an us versus them dichotomy, we become easy prey to any tyrant, any dictator, any untruth. But when we unite as world citizens, no dictator, no tyrant, no untruth can stand for long.
Very salient, David. Thank you. Lynn, unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but if you have just the quickest of comments, we could come to you before we close.
Well, David, that won't work very well with the present situation, because I don't think we'll even be meeting again here. Do you meet monthly? I think it's going to be toast soon, especially after yesterday with Zelensky.
Well, perhaps as a this is a good point to close on. Lynn, you made the comment in the chat, how do we avoid World War III next week? Well, it seems to me that world federalism has probably for a very long time not been as salient as it is right now. This is a small discussion, but at least we are talking, and there are many people in this room virtually who are leading initiatives to try to make the world a more connected and better run place for us all. So thank you. I will now bring us to a close. I have a little bit.
Any final thing I should say to at the Model UN meeting all day next week? Any message to send forward?
Well, Rebecca has her hand up, so I will hand the floor to her to do so.
It was not up for that purpose, but we are coordinating very closely with our friends at UNA USA to stand against the foreign assistance freeze, to stand against the regression and retraction of our international commitments. That Carnegie article would be a wonderful place to start. I'm glad, David, that you found it useful. And if you'd like to talk further on offline, I'm very happy to make myself available, Lynn. But I just wanted to, before we close, and James, maybe you'll preview the next book club. I'm sure you will. I really wanted to ask everybody, if you could, to join me in thanking specifically Hannah Fields for her amazing work to get this issue across the finish line. There is so much that goes on behind the scenes in the publishing and design of these issues that may not be obvious. And we're, of course, so grateful to have her as an author in the issue, but I really wanted to make sure that that got mentioned. Back over to you, James.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. I second that. Hannah's done an amazing job in the last couple of weeks. So a little bit of housekeeping. I will drop right now in the chat for everyone our survey for the session. We really appreciate your feedback. If you could take 5 minutes, it really helps us plan future book clubs. Today's felt like a really vivid discussion and great presentation, but it's really important to know what you want and what you think so that we can plan ahead. Next up, our next session will be with Andreas Bommel, who is the Executive Director of Democracy Without Borders, to discuss his book, the second edition of A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century. We may also be joined by his co-author, former MEP Joe Linen, but that's yet to be confirmed. The first session with Andreas will be on Saturday, the 29th of March. So that will be squeezing another one in this month. That's just how the calendar's worked out. And then the second session will be on April 19th, both starting at our usual time of 12 noon Eastern Coast time. The book is available from the Democracy Without Borders website in PDF and EPUB format. If you want to download a digital version, that's the best place to go. If you would like to order for your own enjoyment, either a paperback or a hardback version, Andreas recommends that you do it from Amazon. I'll put both of those links in the chat in just a moment, because it will take about 2 working weeks for it to arrive from Europe if you were to order it from the Democracy Without Borders website. So that's if you would like to order a hardback book, a paperback or a hardback version, you should do so from Amazon. I've put the link for Democracy Without Borders website in the chat, and now I will do so also for Amazon. For your pleasure. That brings us to a close. Today has been a brilliant session. I thank you all for your questions and your contributions. David Gallup, Emlyn Koster, David Wilcombe, Rebecca Shute, Hannah Fields. Thank you all for your questions and your engagement. Today has felt like a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.